You're watching Experience Comic Culture and Sales, streaming live daily to Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter.
2, 1.
Hey everybody, Christopher, aka the Bronze Age Nerd here. Welcome to Devil's Advocates. I am a collector. I know that's not exactly a shocking revelation, but I'm a collector. I've been a collector pretty much my whole life. And when I say collector, I don't just mean comic books. I mean all kinds of things. I collect action figures. I've collected Lego sets, trading cards, movie posters, a lot of weird and varied things. And I get into these obsessions with items that I want to collect, autographs. There's all kinds of things. Seeing every band I wanted to see at concerts. That's the type of collecting to me. And when I would do that, something always happened every single time. I always focused on quantity. When I'm new to an obsession, a hobby, collecting something, I tend to go for a bunch of stuff. I tend to go for cheap, easy to obtain, to kind of get that sort of dopamine rush from picking something up. And this happens to me over and over and over again. And of course, I'm a comic book collector. So that's happened with comic books as well. As I've downsized my collection and gotten back into collecting, I actually have repeatedly had this problem where I go after too much stuff. And then inevitably what happens is I just increase the size of my collection for whatever it is. And my storage closet that I have, my comic book storage area, my storage unit that I have is a monument built to the absolute scariness of how that can turn out. And occasionally I go back and I look through those things. And I'm so excited that I saved something, that I've held on to something for years because it's now very special to me, or it has a new meaning to me. Sometimes it's because it's really valuable and I can sell that to go for something else that I really want. And also, just most of the time, I'm constantly looking at this pile of stuff that I don't really want anymore. And I have to figure out what to do with it. So in the spirit of that, we're going to talk a little bit tonight about what can happen when you end up with too much of something and how to prevent that from happening in the first place. And also just strategies to kind of deal with that, to kind of maybe reorganize your collection. And of course, we're going to be talking about comic book collecting tonight. So I want to hear about it in the comments, all your history with comic book collecting, as far as having too much, too little, trying to acquire more, all that kind of stuff. So be ready to talk about it tonight here on Devil's Advocates. Hey, so once again, I'm Christopher, aka the Bronze Age Nerd, and tonight I am flying solo. That's right, no producer Kyle on tonight's show. Something kept him away from the show tonight, and he may pop up in the comments. He might not. Everything's all good. He's safe and sound and all that kind of stuff, but it was just better for him to be away from the show tonight. With that said, we're going to move on with the show, and we should have Kyle back next week, so no worries there. And I do want to say hi to everybody who's popped in the chat real fast that I can see on my end. I won't be able to see the Instagram chat, just FYI. If you want tonight, if you want to come over and watch on YouTube or Facebook or any other places that the experience is streaming, that would be awesome, because then I could see your comments instead of having to have Jay try to tell them to me in the private chat or something. But we do want to say hello to TSM.art. Sorry about that. Yo, back to you, man. Thanks for being here. Mr. Nope is in the chat. This is where we meet for Comics Anonymous. Remember, the first step is to admit you have a problem. Kenneth in the chat. What's up, Kenneth? How's it going? We got Skunk Snot. It is going well. It's going well. We got Curtis Celefox in the chat as well. I'm holding it down over here on Facebook. We appreciate that. We need your support over there. And we have Lorena Vila. Hey, everybody. How's it going to you, too? We appreciate everybody being here. So, again, tonight we are talking about comic collecting and what happens if you have too many comics, but also we're going to talk a lot about ways to prevent yourself from getting there in the first place. And in order to frame that, we have a little more time tonight because it's just me talking, so I can kind of add some context to some of the notes I had for the show this week. I will go ahead and tell you a little bit of a story about something that happened to me. So I collected comic books since about the age of technically probably about 7. and I never got rid of a single comic book. I think I did a couple small like neighborhood kid trades at one point when I was around 10 or 11. And then I held on to comic books for a long time, collected on and off for decades. And then in 2018, I sold 90% of my comic collection. So I'm going to tell you about that real fast to kind of give you an idea of what this can look like in real life. So my daughter had just been born. We had to move apartments because the apartment we were in was becoming too expensive for where we lived. We had downsized. We had a lot of new expenses on the way. And so we moved from a 2-bedroom apartment to a 1-bedroom apartment. Comic books didn't have, there was no like, and the previous apartments that we lived in, there was usually like a little storage shed out on the patio, like a little storage closet. That wasn't an option. There wasn't a 2nd bedroom closet, so that wasn't an option. All that space was getting removed, essentially. So I decided to sell my comic books. Now, I didn't sell everything, thankfully. I held on to the vast majority of the stuff that really, truly was sentimental to me. I do regret some of the things I let go. So I think I had approximately, I can't remember exactly now. It's been just long enough that I don't remember. I think it was about 18 long boxes worth. And I think I ended up walking away from that with like 3 short boxes. So I kept, the stuff that really mattered. I kind of pared it down to that. But hey, looking back on it, do I wish I would have kept some of that stuff? Sure. But I am happy I got rid of most of it, because a lot of it, and this is something we're going to talk about later in the show, a lot of it is stuff that I bought to read it once, maybe twice, and didn't really have a need to go back to it. And it was just kind of sitting there. So if you've ever found yourself in this situation where, maybe you're younger than me and you're still collecting those comic books and they're still stacking up, I think it's good for us to talk about what you can do to prevent yourself from ending up in that situation down the road. I always was making excuses for how to add more comics to my collection and for how to add more comic book boxes to the area grew. It went from being like a nice, neat stack to a really wild stack, all that kind of stuff. Right. So I think that happens to a lot of comic book collectors, and it's definitely something I want to talk about tonight. So for the first segment, we're going to kind of, ask ourselves the question, and I really want participation from you in the chat. Do you have too many comic books? And I want to point out that if the subject of this video, if you think that the theory is that you have to get rid of your comic books, that's not the case at all. I'm not saying that. And anytime I talk about the advice of what to do, if you think you have too many comic books, don't think that necessarily applies to you. Consider it a cautionary tale, though, because again, you might be earlier along that journey where you might realizing down the road that you have too many comic books. So it's not meant to target anybody and tell you have too many comic books, you got to get rid of them all. That's not the case. But if your collection has ever grown to a size where you've started to have to really play logistics master and try to figure out, where am I going to put this week's pulls? How am I going to fit another box in my comic area or areas? Do you have more than one area in your home where you keep comic books? That could be a sign. Depending on if some are for display, that's a little bit different. But if you have like a pile here and a pile there, or a closet here and a closet there, hey, that might be too many. That might be perfect for you. That's totally up to you. Curtis says, absolutely. I've reached a point where I'm focusing my collection and have a bunch I've lost interest in, and I'm running out of space. Yes, perfect. Well, I think you came to the right place. I've definitely been there, maybe approaching there again. So this actually is kind of a personal show to me for that reason alone. So when you think about that question, are you starting to see too many comic book boxes pile up? For me, I always hate like I liked and I hated things like having to add a new box in, having to re-shimmy all my comic books around into different boxes. It can be fun if you have the time to do it. As I get older, I have less and less time to do that, and it gets more and more tedious, and I don't really enjoy doing it as much. I used to enjoy it a lot more when I was a kid, and I could have music going. I didn't have, any other distractions. If you're in that position and you start to think of the moving around of your comics as a chore, that might be a good sign. Another thing too is if you have to move, like if you're moving houses, moving apartments, you know, into an apartment, out of a house, into a house, out of an apartment, all that kind of stuff. If you haven't done that in a long time, there's nothing like moving to make you realize how much crap you have, right? I think a lot of us can relate to that. So if you haven't done that in a while, think about what it's going to be like when you have to move all that stuff. I will also throw out there that, like myself, I know a lot of us comic book collectors aren't necessarily in superhuman, super soldier serum, peak physical condition for a human being, right? So physically moving a lot of comic book boxes is something you do need to consider about in that way too. So at least if you get nothing else from this show, remember to get a wide stance and lift with your legs. Don't lift with your back. That's the recommendation I'll give you. And I mean, it's totally fine. If you want to view moving around your comic book boxes as exercise, more power to you. I've been there before too and done that. So the other question that I like to ask is, has your collection negatively impacted a part of your life? And this one, if you don't ask yourself this question, you may not realize that you have a problem. Again, we're at Collecting Anonymous over here, Comics Anonymous. So it's okay to ask ourselves this question. This is a safe space to do that. And what could that mean? That could mean that, let's say, for example, you're single and you enter a relationship and you start cohabitating with somebody, or you start cohabitating with somebody because the economy sucks and you have to get a roommate, whereas before you just lived on your own or something like that, right? And your comic book storage space is an issue for the person that you decide to live with. Now, I'm not saying that if your partner has an issue with your comic books that you should get rid of them. I'm not saying that. But everything is a compromise, right? Like everything in this life is a compromise. And how much you decide to compromise, whether that's nothing at all, whether that's 50-50, that's a consideration that's going to have to be made when you're cohabitating with somebody. So I think that's something that's important to keep in mind. Mr. Nope says, I'm in one room, luckily, but it doubles as my office, out of space almost, and need to buy more boxes. Okay, so at least in your situation, Mr. Nope, it sounds like you're able to buy more boxes, so you probably have room for those boxes, and that can be okay, right? One of the things that we will make sure we talk about later on is not just what to do with getting rid of comics or anything like that, if you want to do that, but also how to manage the comic books you have in a way that's more economical for space reasons, not just necessarily pocketbook money, but also just for space reasons. Economy of space is a real thing. But maybe we could talk about that a little bit too with that. Kyle says, I'm here in spirit, and snarky comments. Perfect. That's really, I mean, that is the essence of Kyle. So we need that here, man. Thanks for popping by in the comments. Milton Stapler says, by the way, Milton, nice to see you around here again. I really appreciate that. Says, I'm not going to lie. My collection is a lit. Okay, so there's a couple things I could take from that comment, Milton. No, I know you've continued it on, but I do want to say, if it's lit for insurance reasons, you shouldn't be talking about it on the internet. No, it's a little unorganized, but it's not too large. Just expecting my son to get it organized for me. And that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up. Because one thing I will talk about a little bit in the show is what happens when your comic books need to move on. And, that could be you hand them down to somebody, which is a way to get rid of some comic books too, of course. It could also be that, look, this is a macabre thing. Could also be what happens when you pass away. There's a meme that goes around, something to the effect of like, I just hope that my wife, when I die, I hope my wife doesn't sell my comic books for what I told her I paid for them. I've always kind of hated that meme, but I understand it for a lot of guys out there. Communication is worth so much, people. If you just talk about that stuff with your significant other, you might be surprised. Then again, you might be negatively surprised. I get that too. But they don't know necessarily what to do with your comic books. Maybe they do. Maybe you're in a unique situation where the people in your family are just as into comic books as you are. But if they aren't, it could be a problem for them. So that's actually something that I do want to talk about. I'm saying that if your partner says you have too many comic books, there are many comics that explain how to fix that. Yeah. And that's what I mean. When I'm saying you shouldn't necessarily just kowtow to whatever somebody says to you, right? Like that's not necessarily what I think should happen. But it is a consideration, right? Like I made an addition to my family with my daughter. That is something that was non-negotiable for me. I had to do it, like I because I wanted to do it. Needed to start a family, and so compromises had to be made. You know, that's just how it works. Collector P says, if I lost a few short boxes from my collection from the 90s, it wouldn't hurt my feelings. Oh, brutal but accurate. Mr. Nope says, no more room. Girlfriend has been on me at the rate I go at. I'm at a crucible. Okay. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. But again, we do have some potential solutions we're going to get to in the show here in a little bit. So one thing is, if it hasn't hit the point where you think you have a problem with your comic collection, at what point would it be too big? And this is like one of those questions that, you know, on my channel, I've made a couple of videos where I've kind of talked about this, where it's that idea of having to look forward when it comes to comic collecting. And as you look forward, start to think about what it's going to mean a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. And at the rate you're expanding, what's that going to feel like to you? Is it going to feel awesome? Like you have like the Library of Alexandria at your disposal for comic books? Great. That's cool. But what's your plan for storing those comic books safely, in a way that's not going to, you know, make you mad every time you got to dig to the bottom box in a column of boxes, that kind of thing? Start to have those kind of conversations with yourself, I guess. Or here at Comics Anonymous, right? And then the other thing that I think is important to ask yourself, it's kind of what I alluded to earlier when I was talking about my collection. The reason that I was able to sell the majority of my collection without pulling my hair out too much. How many times do you read a comic book that you pick up? And when I say that, I'm not necessarily talking about a back issue you buy because you really sought it out and you had a personal reason to go seek out that comic book that was important to you. I'm talking more about the new comic pulls that you buy. Do you read it once? Do you read them twice? Do you read them once every year? Do you read them once every 5 years? When was the last time you read them? When was the last time you pulled out a comic book and realized, like, oh man, I need to change the bag and board on this thing? You know, if you start asking yourself those questions, that might be the time to kind of wonder what's going on. Kyle says it can't be too big. I've asked, and she said too big is a myth. Oh, you meant comic collection size. Never mind. Yes, I was talking about comic books in this particular instance. But yeah, no, it's definitely one of those things where I do think it's important to really stop and consider the future. And collecting can be a very now thing. It can be a very, like, look, for me, and I know for a lot of you, I'm not trying to generalize for everybody, I know this is true for a lot of people, the thrill of picking up a comic book is the most intense when I first buy that comic book. Next most intense when I'm like personally checking it out at home and reading it. And then honestly, for 99.5% of the comics in my collection, that just starts to kind of fall off after there to like less and less enjoyment. For some of those comic books, that the 0.05%, that either goes up over time or it stays the same. But for the vast majority of my comic books, I don't go back and reread them all the time. So I make a conscious decision to collect less physical copies of comic books that I know I'm not going to be rereading that run, or I don't feel like I need to support the creators or the comic team behind it. And that's part of what we're going to talk about later as well. So I think what we're going to do right now is we're probably going to take our first break of the show, where we're going to, thank some of the sponsors here on the EXP, which is very important to do. There's some great comic book companies out there. Let's talk about them for a few minutes and some of the other great shows here on the EXP. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about comic book collecting and what happens when we have too many comic books.
in a world where you hit like and subscribe on our YouTube channel. That'd be really great. Thanks.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Once again, I am Christopher, aka the Bronze Age Nerd. Co-host and producer Kyle is in the comments occasionally. Feel free to say hi to him and let him know you all love him and appreciate him. But he's taking the night off for some important stuff. And so we are talking tonight about your comic book collection and what happens if it gets a little too big. Okay, insert elementary school jokes there. But yeah, what happens if it gets a little too big for your liking and gets a little out of control? You don't want to end up on an episode of Hoarders. I don't think anybody wants to do that. At the same time, I want to prevent you from feeling like you get to, and this happens to collectors. They get to a point where things like mental health start to affect their collection and they get rid of the entire collection completely. And I would never personally advocate for that unless you felt like you had like a real addiction problem, maybe. But anyways, the point being is there's a lot of reasons why you might want to downsize your collection. So in this section of the show, we're going to talk a little bit about ways you can actually make your collection smaller that are hopefully a little bit more agreeable to most people. Also ways that you can minimize the impact of having a large comic book collection, like different ways to store them, that kind of stuff, so that we can kind of talk about that a little bit in terms of like, hey, I don't want to get rid of my entire comic book collection. Like, why are we talking about that? Well, that's totally understandable. And I don't really recommend anybody do that. I don't think that's the right way to approach it. Again, unless you think you need to. Oh, yeah. I was just thinking about that, Mr. Nope. Has anyone seen the video of the guy with the world record largest collection? Looked like every room of the house and garage was filled top to bottom with short boxes. Now, was it really the world record? Because I feel like Mile High would have been the world record at one point with that private collection. But yeah, that's when I said Hoarders. That's what I was thinking of specifically, were the pictures that came out of that person's house. Aggressively relaxing. Hey, what's up? Welcome to the show, man. Glad to have you here. You have convinced me. I'm officially announcing my "Here, you throw this crap away" mystery box. I love this on multiple levels. Aggressively relaxing. I do hate to say it, but I think there's some of those mystery boxes out there. James Sanchez, hey, thanks for making a comment. We appreciate that. My PC is huge, but just recently got the opportunity to pick up 160 long boxes. Congratulations, or I'm sorry, I don't know, but I think congratulations are in order. This would put me in a situation where I need to be selling, thinking about what a pain that would be, but also exciting. And that's exactly what we're about to talk about in a minute, James. So I'm glad it may not on that level. So hopefully we can kind of help you with that, but that is something that's definitely important to talk about. Kyle says, if your collection gets too big for its britches, might as just Destination XL for bigger britches. Oh, that is hilarious. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not wearing a DXL shirt tonight, but I often do have DXL shirts, so that's funny. So yeah, we're going to talk about it. So look, the bare bones easy way to get rid of your collection is to sell. If you're trying to downsize your collection, that's the easiest way to do it, right? So we will be talking about selling. I'll go in depth into some of my experiences selling, talk a little bit about what you can expect from that process, maybe some best practices, that kind of thing. But that is the kind of elephant in the room, right? Like selling your collection, or the thing I'm going to talk about first, which is giving away parts of your collection. So I'm going to talk about some ways you could give away parts of your collection. And then I'll talk about a middle ground, and then we'll talk about selling at the end of this segment. And also a little bit after that, we'll talk about ways you can just kind of store your collection better and more efficiently in space. Before I do that, I do want to read Lorena's comment. I only have about 12 short boxes, and at first I wanted to complete full runs, but now I'm just going for cover art, and I would want to display on my walls and rotate them. And that's cool. You probably can't tell too well. I've only got 2 up here, but I've got actually a bunch of comics on the wall over here. I think displaying is really fun. I really worry about some methods of displaying, and so I really try to caution like safe displaying, like UV protected ways, really good cases in case something were to fall off the wall, or an earthquake or another natural disaster. Ways that if your huge comic book collection fell over and shook the entire house, try to be thoughtful of that. So when it comes to that, the idea of giving away comic books, so it's it's on one hand deceptively easy, and on the other hand, you can actually apply some strategy to it. So yes, you could just give away your comic books. That's one thing you could do. The ones you don't want anymore, the ones you don't like. The ways that I think are probably the best to do this are if you have a local community for comic books, like a Facebook group that's local to your area, or maybe a Discord, or other different kind of groups like that. Private areas, private groups where you discuss, maybe you guys have local comic swaps, that kind of thing, where you can give away your comic books that way. That's one way to do it. And you'll probably even be able to transition to something I'm talking to a little bit later, which is maybe trading some of your comic books, like actually doing a swap, right? That's no way to do it. Maybe you could swap a bunch of comic books for a few comic books, that kind of thing. So when it comes to that, that's one way you can do it. But the other way you can do this is you could give it to family members. Maybe there's young people in your family that you can give comic books to, and you could give them stuff. It'd be awesome if you could give them stuff that is kind of tailored to their age. Certainly, I recommend doing age-appropriate comics. I also recommend checking with their parents first. But as long as that's all okay, giving away some of your comic books that way can be very rewarding. You can start new readers on a path to where they're reading more comic books. That is definitely one way to do it. Another way is to donate them. Like for example, in my area, I have a public library that is not like a real public library. Like they are funded literally only with local dollars. Like I don't live in an incorporated area, so it's not like a city sponsored public library, really. It's more of a independent public library. And if you go to smaller areas, you might be able to find those, the outskirts of the big city, that kind of thing. Your library might take the donation. I don't necessarily love the idea of doing like Goodwill. It's not the end of the world, but I think there are like veterans groups that you might be able to donate comic books to, that they can hand out. Folks, we have a reporter in the field here.
Yeah, I wanted to give you guys a suggestion of things you could do when you have too many comics and most of them aren't worth anything, that could bring you some real joy. I do want to give a trigger warning for the hardcore among us. This could be traumatic. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay, I have to change my cameras. Hold on. Front camera. Back camera. All right, you guys see what we're doing?
Kind of.
Okay, so when you're done, it looks like this. So then you could take your pictures that you take like at convention and put them in the frames that you've covered with the bits of your comics that are already cover off. Basically stuff that you don't want, can't use anymore. Stuff like this. I told you it'd be triggering.
I mean, there's some cool stuff. Like I've seen some people make like signs, like letters and stuff like that. If your initials K, for example, I have a sign that's a K that's covered in comic book panels that somebody is that called decoupage or whatever that you do that for? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, and that's where I got the idea, was seeing people do that. I'm like, hey, what if we put it on frames for all of the 1.5 million photos from conventions?
Well, and here's like kind of a suggestion that goes along with that, which is what I was going to get to when I'm talking about like donation groups. There's also like college or local art programs that sometimes would be willing to use comic book pages in their art projects if you talk to the instructors. That's actually something that, I've kind of been doing recently for a thing I was working on.
Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts too.
There you go. Yeah, there are groups that can use them.
Scouts, whatever they're calling themselves these days.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
But the other thing I wanted to quickly mention in doing this, right, is make sure that you are on your mental health meds when you start tearing your comics apart, because it really is sort of disturbing. Like, it could get really dark, but at the end it becomes really cathartic, like good, like you don't really have to think too hard. You just kind of cut and paste and cut and paste. And it's kind of nice.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the other thing too, is even when it comes to like selling, giving away comic books, I always recommend, being on any medications you're taking, making sure you're in a stable mental state, but also like, take a week to think about it. If you're talking about like giving or selling away comic books or like a large chunk of your collection, if something comes up and somebody's like, oh man, some kids talking and they really love Superman. You're like, man, I got a bunch of Superman comics I really don't want anymore. Sure, obviously offer to give them to that kid. But if it comes down to this like decision where you're like suddenly comic books, it is extremely possible that you will regret that decision down the road if you make it in haste. So very good advice.
All right, I'm going to go back to the comments and make more fat jokes and other kinds of jokes.
Please do.
We'll see you later.
Later, Kyle. And speaking of comments, I just want to get to JD's comment. Libraries will always take them, but they'll do the same thing as a thrift store, sell them for funds. That is probably true in some cases, especially like the larger libraries I was talking about. Again, I have a library where if I gave them a bunch of comics, they would put them in a bin for kids to check out or take. So, or anybody that goes to that library, right? So you do want to check with your library. Also see what they're doing with comics they may have already. So if they're not doing anything with comic books, and you talk to the librarian about what their plans would be if you gave them comic books, that's a way to prevent that. But that's a good point. You don't really want them, necessarily selling them unless that's what you want them to do to raise funds. Mr. Nope says, I've done that to a clipboard. That's cool. Hey, Mark, how's it going? Putting your art degree to use. There you go. JD says, I did that in a day room at the sanitarium. It was good. It was good that day. Oh, that's funny. Curtis says, I'd rather a library sell for funds, though. It's at least going to do a service that many benefit from. Yeah, that's, and again, unless you're comfortable with that idea, which if you are, great. There's a potential avenue. Hey, look, I'll do kind of a shameless plug here because it's not for me. I do a charity event every year called Heroes for Heroes. I have had people donate comic books to that cause, and I've done like bundles or packages of comic books to sell. But when I sell those, 100% of the proceeds goes to a charity. For me, it's a charity called Mission 22. They help out preventing veteran suicide and mental health for veterans and their family members. And that's a really great charity, I think. So it's an event I support every year. There are other people in comics. I have a water bottle right here that has a sticker on it that says Comics Curing Cancer. And that's another group of people in the community that do a charity event. There's several charity events in the comic books out there. If you want to do, here's my advice. Ask the group organizers or people that are doing that event, ask them what they're looking for or tell them what you have to offer and see if they'd be interested in it. Don't be offended if they say no, because if it's a bunch of crap you don't want, there's a chance that they might not think they might be able to do much with it, and it might take away from their fundraising efforts. One thing I did, for example, is I would take books from people and I would give them away as freebies inside packages if I didn't think that they would fetch much on their own. Or I could build runs or small lots out of it. Some people might want to read, which would be great. You just have to be a little careful with manipulating that, but that can be a way that you can put your comic books to good use. So that's, when it comes to the donation and the giving away aspect, that's something that I like to think about. The other thing I mentioned, and I'll kind of go over it again a little bit more, is trades. I do. They used to be Comic Security, but yeah, that's a difficult fundraiser for sure. So when it comes to doing trades, that's another thing you can do. It's a little tougher if you're trying to go from a lot of comic books to a few comic books, but it is possible, especially if you're talking to somebody who's a bulk dealer or a comic book shop, perhaps even. But you can theoretically take a bunch of comic books and turn it into a few comic books, which would help you with some of your space problems. This might work better for, again, like things like a full run or a bunch of comics from a similar era or a series of titles. Like if you have a bunch of X-Men books or a bunch of Avengers books or a bunch of Batman related books, that might work better as opposed to like, hey, here's a bunch of random stuff I don't want anymore. Then again, that might be exactly what that person's looking for. Again, if they're a seller, a vendor, it's possible. And hey, if the conversion rate is terrible, that's something to keep in mind, but also keep in mind that bulk selling comic books can often be difficult if you're trying to make money, period. So consider that they might give you more in trade than they would in cash. And you can also get other offers on the stuff too, right? Like you can go to an LCS and see what they're willing to offer, which is going to lead us to the final area of literally downsizing your collection. And that is selling. And so we're going to talk about this for a little bit. I'm going to take some water so I can talk about it a little bit more clearly. Once again, got that Comics Curing Cancer sticker on there. So we'll give them another free plug on that. There's a great cause. So when it comes to selling comic books, again, I sold my collection to an LCS. I regret the price I got for it, but I was kind of in a difficult situation. And I sold at probably the second worst time to sell comic books in the last 20 years. So it wasn't a great time for the stuff I had. It was right before some of the stuff that I had from the eras that I had started taking off in value. So that's a different situation. But you do have to kind of be aware of that. You could be selling your comic books at one of the worst times to sell your comic books. So always take that into consideration, always kind of sleep on it and take some time to pause and decide if that's really for you. The other thing you can do is you can go on places like eBay, or you can go on places like Mercari or Facebook sales groups, Facebook comic book groups. You could go on Instagram and do claim sales. There are apps you can download and sell on selling platforms. There are consignment opportunities that you could have. There are people that sell comic books online. You can approach them and say, hey, I have these comic books. If I were to, send you a kind of a list of what I have or what I'd be interested in selling, would you consider selling them? And can you tell me what kind of rates I'm going to get? The biggest thing is that once you go down that path, please start being discerning about what you're willing to get for those comic books. You can't expect most of the time to take cover price on a bunch of comic books that you probably don't want anymore, unless you're putting in comic books have appreciable value. You're probably going to get a fraction of cover price for random run filler issues. I mean, think about it. Think about all the stuff you've seen littering dollar bins for years. Occasionally, yes, you can pull some great stuff out of dollar bins. Most of the time, it's going to be a lot of comic books that are not desirable to most people, except for the person that just happens to want it that day, right? So if that's the majority of what you're selling, don't be expecting to break the bank with that. If you try to sell them individually and on your own, and you're willing to take the time to price them out, and you're willing to take the time to put them into like thoughtful lots that might do really well, or you can, put them in lots where, one big book is going to catch everybody's interest and you're going to sell a bunch of stuff around it to kind of get rid of it. That's another strategy you could use. There's lots of ways to do that. For me, I think though that, joining up on, I think Kyle was actually going to say this. Seriously though, join those existing groups. Doing what I did as a way to turn your beard white way too early and give you ulcers all the time. Yeah. Selling comics, is not it's not an autopilot kind of thing. Unfortunately, it requires a lot of work. It requires work in ways that I never really expected when I started selling, because comic book buyers are not always the most fun to deal with. Comic book sellers aren't always the most fun to deal with, right? A lot of times, unfortunately, it's because they have to deal with comic book buyers. And a lot of comic book buyers are very lowball offer. They're very demanding. They expect a lot of pictures. And then when, which is fine to a certain extent, but a lot of times it goes over the top. So if you're going to go down that route, you do have to expect to be dealing with a lot of hassle. But if you want the most return on your money, you're going to have to put that time into it. Keep into account that time is money, right? So that's the other factor there. But when it comes to selling your comic books, as long as you've thought it out, as long as you've thought about the process, what I recommend doing is, well, we're going to talk about this in the kind of the next segment of the show, but I really recommend taking into consideration what you want that collection to get down to. Like whether that's a number, whether that's certain titles, whether that's certain publishers, certain creators, but just think about what, I think a physical space that you want it to occupy when it's all said and done is a really good goal. And then my recommendation is to literally start pulling stuff from that collection until you get to that point. Like just pull until it shrinks down to that point. And then right next to it, you've got a giant stack of stuff you need to sell or whatever, or donate, or a combination of those things. That's the beauty of this, is you can do kind of all those things. But there's one other way when it comes to downsizing your collection that I do want to make sure I talk about. And that is there's ways to more efficiently store your comic books. So for a lot of people collect long boxes or short boxes, and they make large stacks of them. And I do this too, because I'm crazy. I have some comics that are stored that way. But there's also other ways to store your comic books that can make that less daunting. There's a few different companies that make what do I want to call this? Like easily available, market purchasable options for storage boxes or drawers or houses for comic books. I know there's a couple companies right at the top of the bat. BCW does it. There's also, I think, just comicbookdrawers.com or something like that does it as well. That has like a proprietary option. The BCW drawer houses will fit most standard short boxes. I think they have long box ones as well. I'm actually not sure on that. I think they do. But yeah, any of those kinds of solutions. You could also custom make something like you can use Metro racks, make sure that they are rated to store the weight of comic book boxes, though, because comic book boxes are heavy. There's also, there's lots of other kinds of shelving units you could get that can hold the comic books. Because here's what a problem for a lot of people is they have comic book boxes stacked 4 deep, or let's be realistic, sometimes 5, 6, 7 deep. I wouldn't recommend that, by the way. And then they need to get to the bottom of it, and they got to move everything, and they get tired of doing that. And it's a big hassle, especially if you do A to Z alphabetizing and you want to read something in the V's. That's going to suck, right? Like, that's just something that makes people not want to organize their comic books, not want to deal with them, not want to rebag and board them, not want to read them, those kinds of things, right? Another solution that I love, and you can't see it, but it's right here. I'm tapping it, and you might be able to hear the metal, is a legal size filing cabinet. You can do the standard legal drawers. I do recommend you try to find HON, H-O-N brand, because they're very strong, very sturdy, and they can hold the weight of comic books. You do have to kind of, like, if you want to do it safely, you have to kind of DIY some stuff. Like I used, what do they call that stuff? The whiteboard, not particle board, the whiteboard poster board, kind of. Yeah. Styrofoam board, stuff you can put into the big crack that's in the middle of them, so that you don't have a big gap for where your comics are going to go. You got to be careful that they're deep enough, like they have enough clearance for the comic books. There's also the wide ones that some people use. There's a Facebook group for comic book filing cabinets. That's an option. BCW short boxes, I think, are also bigger than most short boxes. I have the comic houses, and they're really good as long as you keep it no higher than 6 stacked. Yeah, and I have a bunch of those in my closet. If you're going to stack deep, use lids and then cross stack, so alternate directions. Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice too, if you're doing the stacks. But just honestly, like this filing cabinet, it's a 4 drawer tall HON. It's I got it for free. I hauled it away from somebody's house. And as long as I hauled it away, they gave it to me for free. And you'll find deals like that. Offices going out of business, office supply stores, office furniture auctions. Again, what I would recommend is bringing some comic books with you. If you can test out the stuff, make sure all the drawers are in good shape, make sure there's not a bunch of rust. You can refinish these, repaint them. There's actually that comic book Facebook group. You can order like magnets to put on the sides of these things that completely act like a new skin for the filing cabinet. And people do it on the front. They cut out around the handles, and they put comic book art on them. It looks really clean. So that's an option that people do. So the point is there's more strategic ways to store your comic books that might actually help you store your comic book collection. So I got one more little section of things we're going to talk about here. I think it's going to be kind of a fun place to wrap up, and we can kind of talk about some of the philosophy about how to prevent this problem in the first place, so you don't feel like you're kind of getting into this. But before we do that, we're going to take another little ad break here where we can talk about some of the great shows around the EXP and some of the great sponsors. So check that out. When we come back, we'll close out. If you got any closing comments for us, make sure you're ready to put those in the chat and I'll address them. And we'll see you again in a couple minutes for the rest of the show.
Download our app on Google Play and the App Store. It's so simple, even my mommy can use it.
Hey, welcome back to the Devil's Advocates here on the EXP. I am your host, Christopher, aka the Bronze Age Nerd. And tonight we're talking about one of the most taboo subjects in all of comic books. Something that is, you want to talk about striking fear into the hearts and minds of comic book readers? Folks, getting rid of or selling or donating parts of your comic book collection, it's terrifying to most people. It doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be a big deal. In fact, this is something that kind of going through something like this with my daughter right now, because we're trying to get her to downsize some of her toys. And it's like, one of the strategies I tell her is, hey, when you downsize your toys, it does mean that you have room for other toys in the future. It doesn't mean you're not going to never play with those toys again or play with other toys. You might enjoy more. Same thing's true for comic books. If you're getting to a point where you're constantly making excuses for what you're going to do to add comics to your collection, it might be time to get rid of some of that collection or figure out a different way to store them, right? Whether that's a different space too. Like, that's something that's really personal to each person and something I can't really handle, but reconsider where you're putting your comic books. Maybe you have a bigger space in your house or your apartment or whatever that makes more sense. The one thing I do want to make sure I mention, just because this is a very important caution for people, if you have comics that you care about at all and you think about storage units, okay, make sure they're climate controlled. Make sure that they're, if you live in a very temperate climate where it doesn't get too hot and it doesn't get too cold, especially really close to each other, at least make sure it's really well insulated. And I still wouldn't be putting comic books that I care too much about in a space like that. You really do want to make sure you have a storage unit that is climate controlled reliably. Those are very expensive usually compared to regular storage units. Storage units themselves are pretty expensive. So that is something that I kind of caution against most of the time. But if you really need to get to that spot, if your sanity and your space is more important, that's a potential solution. So yeah, Curtis says, talking about filing cabinets, you can decoupage them. Exactly. That's another thing you can do. Actually, one really cool thing I've seen people do with filing cabinets is there's a paint you can put on them that you can basically turn it into a blackboard. And so you can, chalk draw all over it if you do your own art. That's another thing you can do too. Let your kids draw all over it, whatever, with chalk, So let's talk about how to avoid this kind of problem in the first place, or different strategies for preventing this from happening. And the most obvious ways to talk about that, in my opinion, are stuff that I've kind of transitioned over to doing, to be honest with you. Digital comic book collecting is one way to do it. Something we've talked about here on the Devil's Advocate show before. It's also kind of a hot or cold button topic for people. Some people love it. Some people hate it. I totally understand. It's not for everybody. I actually I don't have it within reach. I've got a giant, Samsung tablet with a bright, awesome OLED screen. It's about the size of a comic book page. Actually, I think it's the size of a comic book page. I also draw on it and do comic art, amateur comic book art on it and stuff. So that's an option. You can read comic books digitally. You have a big monitor. You can do that digitally. It is one way to prevent. I mean, obviously, you don't have to worry about the physical considerations. You have to worry about things like how many gigabytes your comic book collection is taking up then in that way. But if you've bought comics from like a service, potentially you can download them, again in the future if you need to. Obviously, there's a lot of baked in problems with digital, like you have to worry about whether or not you retain the rights to be able to download it. And there's a lot of other considerations, but I'm just saying it's one way that if you know, you just want to read the comic books, it is one way to go to prevent yourself from having too many comic books. And by the way, it also goes the other direction too. Instead of just going from print to digital, you can go from digital to print. And what I mean by that is if you really find yourself enjoying a series, and you're like, but reading it digitally doesn't feel the same to me, even though now I know I like it, then you can go buy the copies, or you can go buy a trade paperback. Trade paperbacks are the other thing I was going to mention. They still take up a physical space, and that is a consideration. But I know most comic book collectors generally have if they have a bunch of comic books, they also have a separate section on their bookshelf or something where they have trade paperbacks, hardcovers, things like that. So if you still enjoy reading physical, it's a little bit more of a space savings. You know, depending on you as the collector, you may not have to treat those as carefully as you do comic books and rebag and board them and all that kind of stuff too. So something to keep in mind. Kyle says, in my younger days, I bought a foreclosure house down the street for my comics. When I bought my store, I sold most of those books and then sold the house. And when the market came back, profits equals more books. So that is absolutely one way you could do it. That is actually a cool story that I'm glad you told that, Kyle. Thank you. So yeah, those are just some different methods that I've thought of is the digital, the trade paperbacks, omnibuses, that kind of stuff. I still like the idea even because it works with trade paperbacks, you can give those to somebody else to read. You can sell them for a discount sometimes. You can trade with people. Those are all still options. It does kind of transfer one physical problem to another physical problem, but it is something you can do. 2 out of 10 wouldn't recommend, but it was a good time. So there you go. Hey, at least it was a learning experience, for sure. So the other thing is, I talked about it a little bit before. So the example I wrote out here, and I'll kind of read from my notes here for a second, is having the idea of having a collection goal in mind. And what I mean by that is I want you to really think about where you want your collection to be in the future. And I know I mentioned this before, but I really want it to sink in. And it's not just for storage space requirements, by the way. It also can be for having a love for your comic book collection. This weird thing's happened to me where I've kind of looked at my comic book collection a few times and I've been like, this isn't really the collection I want. Like, I love parts of it a lot. I love parts of it. There's parts of it I would never get rid of, but it's really not the collection I want. And so I've had to kind of constantly reevaluate, trying to think down the road. What do I want to look back and look at that I've collected? What do I actually want that collection to be made up of? Do I want it to be made up of a bunch of like really cool cover art? I know we had people in the chat earlier mentioning that, and that's great. Or do you want it to be made up of runs? Or do you want it to be made up of comic books you had and read or wished you could have read when you were a kid? If you want it to be made up of first appearances of characters you like, you can write all this stuff out and really start to think about it, whether that's writing it into like some kind of a notes program, or if that's physically writing it out, drawing a picture of like what you think that's going to look like in your storage space. All of it sounds a little crazy, but it can really be helpful. And I think that it's beneficial. Mr. Nub says, I'm just stockpiling for Apocalypse reading. Imagine the joy we'd bring Geiger if he stumbled on our books. That's pretty good. I need all the viewers to promise me that they won't let Marie Kondo near their comic books. Yeah, I mean, so that in a way, it's kind of funny because that is actually part of what I'm talking about here. And I know Kyle's kidding around in the comments. It actually is probably dead serious, but you really like. I have this thing. Why I mentioned reading the comic book one time is when I sold that collection for the first time. There was a lot of it that I was going through that I'm like, man, I'm glad I read this comic book, but I'm never going to reread this again. Like, there's nothing in it for me anymore. And so, I was very glad to have a chance to kind of purge out a lot of my collection, because now I made space for stuff that I do want to read more and more, and stuff that I do want to be able to kind of like pull out of a box and look at from time to time. Right. So I really encourage that, whether that's 1 year down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. And here's the deal. If there's multiple kinds of collectors and there's combinations of all those kinds of collectors, but if you're the kind of collector that goes to the comic book shop every week and you pick up 10 titles, 15 titles, 20 titles on your pull list and from your pull box, and you start thinking about it, let's say you buy 10 comic books a month. Let's say, that's probably low for most comic book collectors, but let's just say you do that. 10 comic books a month. Okay. So that's 120 comic books a year. Think about it. Think how fast you're going to fill up a short box in terms of years, or a long box, or whatever you collect, right? Now start thinking about how that's going to fill up over years, right? Like, so 5 years down the road, if I'm adding a short box a year, that's 5 new short boxes on average. Maybe that's a sustainable pace for you. Maybe you want more comic books, but maybe you're also going out and buying older comic books, back issues and that kind of stuff, collections, making purchases on, different selling platforms and stuff like that, to where you're also adding those comic books in your collection. Start to kind of track that stuff out on average for a month or two, and kind of think about how much you're going to end up adding up to your collection in that time frame. Is that something that you really want to be dealing with? And like I mentioned earlier in the show, is it something that when you pass away, do you want your friends and family members dealing with? Do you really want them selling comic books that you worked for years to acquire for pennies on the dollar to somebody who's going to turn around and flip them for a bunch more? Like, they're going to put out an ad on Craigslist, and somebody who's going to, basically a comics wholesaler is going to come by and make them a low ball offer and pick them all up. Maybe that's not going to happen, but think about it in those terms. That could happen, right? This is where things like insurance evaluation and all that kind of stuff comes in handy. Having, like an app like, Overstreet Access, like we talked about with Sean from Overstreet a while ago, or CLZ or something like that. Having that stuff all tracked can be very beneficial, but also make sure your people that you're in your life can get into that. Because if you have it all on your app and it's on your phone and your phone's locked and they're not very tech savvy, or there's no way to get past your biometric lock, what's it going to do for you? They can't get into that. Real talk. Don't let somebody else force you into deciding if something brings you joy. Only you can make that call, and on your own time. And that's 100% true. That's 100% true. Like that. And that's why, like I agreed with Kyle earlier. When he's talking about making sure, you're on medication. I even expand that. Just make sure you sleep on it if you can, for a week at least. Because I think you should take your time on this kind of stuff. Nothing in the terms of getting rid of your comic book collection or parts of your comic book collection or any of that should be rushed. It should be a natural process for you. So yeah, that's kind of, the gist of the thoughts that I have on this topic. Really kind of thinking about what your comic book collection should look like is an important task. Really being honest with yourself about it, whether or not you think you have too many comic books, is also an equally important task for that, in my opinion. Like, you really need to kind of ask yourself that question, because there's this thing that happens too, and I don't want to get too deep dive into this, but like, a lot of people, a lot of comic collectors will look on social media and we'll see other comic book collectors with these amazing collections. And if you get jealous, or you start to like not feel like your collection's where you want it to be, then use that as part of your motivation to like rework what you think your collection should look like, from what you actually, where you're at now to where you do want it to go. Like, that's my advice. And that's kind of a real mental health thing that I think people do kind of run into. And then like, also just like, hey, if you're somebody who reads comic books every week and you just like to read all the comic books coming out, and you love collecting those, that's great. But then if you don't go back and reread them, that's fine. Just have a plan in place for going back and getting rid of those older issues or older runs, or selling them as complete runs or whatever, to kind of put some money back into that hobby, or towards another goal you might have, like going to conventions or getting commissions, or any of that kind of stuff, right? Like, supporting your LCS in other ways, for example. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. And unless I see any more comments come through the chat, I am going to take a couple minutes to talk about some of the stuff coming up here on the EXP. Coming up Tuesday, you're going to have, starting at 7 Eastern, 6 Central, we have Minute to Skim It with Miss Jen and Jay. Mint Hunter will be returning soon. He's welcomed a new little reader into his family. He'll be coming back. But for now, at 10 Eastern, 9 Central, you also have Kicking It with Henri. Go check out his show, where you might be able to pick up some other fun stuff to add to your collection, and hopefully it fits in just perfectly, and you can listen a minute to skim it to make sure those comics are worthy additions to your collection that are coming out this week, right? With they're reviewing some of the new comic books coming out. So that's my advice for that. Devil's Advocates will be back next week with another topic. We haven't quite figured it out what exactly it is yet. We have a short list of ideas, but this is where you can really help us out. You could actually go suggest a topic for Kyle and I to talk about next week. And it could be anything. It could be something with how to deal with and manage your collection. It could be something that you think is kind of controversial in the comic book scene right now. It could be something about creators or creative teams that you like or dislike, or something you want to get our opinion on. So Jay just dropped a link into the chat right now where you can go fill out a form and get those kind of ideas and suggestions to us. So maybe we could talk about that topic for you guys next week. That's something we could do. Absolutely. If you're watching on the rewind, or if you're watching here live, I just want to say thank you for watching the show. Thank you for checking it out. If you are watching on the rewind, feel free to drop a comment down below in that comment section and let us know how we did. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the EXP so you can check out all that great content I mentioned coming up and get alerts for all that stuff too by hitting the bell. And until next week, this has been Devil's Advocates, and I'll catch you in the next one. Have a great night, everybody.
Join the party. Head over to our Linktree to find all the links for everywhere the experience is all the time.